Requesting connection. Established. Encrypted. We're live. The show you've been asking for. Advice, technology, and community. Linux first, all others second. This is Ask Noah.
Live from Multispeed Technologies, the Ask Noah show starts right now. This is the show where we came to do all the things on Linux they said couldn't be done and take your questions on how to do the same. The phone lines are open this hour to be a part of the program. It is a free call. 1-855-450-NOAH. That's 1-855-450-6624, or send an email to live@asknoahshow.com. My name is Noah Chalaya. I am your host. Delighted to be here with you as another episode of the Ask Noah show kicks off this hour. Joining me, as always, my co-host, Steve Ovens. Welcome, sir.
Hey, Noah, how are you?
I've had a week, but it's been good. Our first question, Steve, comes from our interactive matrix bot. You can message this bot 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It's the best employee we've ever had. He doesn't get tired. He doesn't stop responding. He's there all the time and collects the questions and then places them right in front of our eyeballs as we get started with the show. So you can message that bot at questions:linuxdelta.com. DJ writes in and says, any recommendations for using SSH clients on networks that are actively block SSH? To go a bit deeper with a practical use case, I have a device that I own. It's a personal unrooted Android device with no MDM. I regularly use it to connect via SSH over the internet to other machines that I own. Many public networks, e.g. cafe, Wi-Fi, guest networks, all of those kinds of things will block traffic on most, if not all, ports other than 80 and 443. But most of those will still allow straight SSH traffic over port 443 without requiring S-tunnel or the like. A guest network that I use regularly recently, quote-unquote, upgraded its infrastructure, apparently including its firewall, in a way that no longer allows me to connect via SSH over port 443, causing strange errors that just go away when I reconnect via SSH over my cellular data connection. Still, would be nice to use SSH over an untrusted Wi-Fi. What causes this? How can I get around it? I'm aware of deep packet inspection and filtering as a possible cause, as well as solutions like S-tunnel to encapsulate blocked traffic. That can be a pain to set up on some platforms. OpenVPN also has OBFS proxy, but that really amplifies the pain. Is there an easier way these days? Anything with WireGuard, Nebula, Daemon, SAW, or other newfangled things I've yet to play with? I've enjoyed the networking tutorials from earlier Ask Noah show episodes this year, a good review of the basics, but now it's also about the limits of my networking knowledge. I'm wondering if there's an interest in more advanced tutorials to deep dive further into networking. Kudos to Noah and Steve and regular contributors from the Ask Noah show community. Please keep up the great work. So a couple things there. I guess, Steve, off the bat, do you have anything that you say, hey, this is what I do when I find myself in those situations?
So I have to be particularly careful that I'm not breaching some terms of service of Wi-Fi that I go on. So I do try to be careful that I'm reading those appropriately, because when you are doing something like SSHing out from a network, your origin traffic is coming from that network, and then they have some liability in terms of the thing that you're doing on their network, which is different than when you VPN in and use a VPN endpoint to do your traffic, because from your VPN endpoint, and the liability is there. So I guess my first disclaimer is I understand what you're trying to do and why you're trying to do it, and I've been there, but you do want to be a little bit careful of, be mindful of the fact that they are somewhat liable. At very least, the finger gets pointed at them when you do something like this and their source IP is exposed.
Yeah, that's great advice. Walking a mile in the other person's moccasins. I see this from both sides, right? Because on one hand,
so I guess when I'm doing something like this, I tend to use OpenVPN, or sometimes I use WireGuard. And again, with that idea that I'm using a VPN endpoint and I'm not worried so much about the terms of service. I don't generally just pure SSH out, because then that causes things to have to punch through firewalls, and you're worried about deep packet inspection and other things of that nature. So I guess the easiest thing to do is, as long as you're not breaching any terms of service, have WireGuard connect out over port 443 and then just join whatever network that you're comfortable doing your SSH traffic from.
That's great advice. I see this from both sides because on one hand, I'm frequently the guy inside of a coffee shop or frequently the guy inside of a cafe that needs to get an SSH connection out to a server that's acting up and I need to go kick its butt. And on the other hand, we also set up networks all the time for people that say, hey, the only thing I want people doing is getting on the interwebs and browsing through the web browser. I don't want any funny stuff going on, so just block it all. You know, I've dealt with both sides of that a little bit, but ultimately what it comes down to is one of the reasons that we recommend OpenVPN to our clients is precisely because you can obfuscate that traffic to look like any other encrypted traffic going over 443. And so because the packets are encrypted, they really can't distinguish what kind of traffic that is. WireGuard, if you go the WireGuard route, which can absolutely do what you're asking it to do, you can also have WireGuard only pull up and fire when you want to send traffic to that specific destination. And so that's a great way to go. And so, yeah, to answer your question, yes, WireGuard will do that, a new confangled thing that you might not have played with. The other thing that you might look at is an SSH manager. So things like gravitational teleport, and there are others out there. We interviewed Gabe Ingersoll, and so I'm more familiar with that product than others, but there are many out there. And one of the nice things about using an SSH manager is a lot of times many of these utilities will just render inside of a web browser. And then from the web browser, you are on a separate box, and then you're using that box to reach out. So it addresses a couple of things. First of all, your traffic out to the SSH manager's box is all over its HTTPS traffic, just like any other encrypted website. And then to Steve's point, the source IP for anything you're doing after that point becomes the in this case, gravitational teleport box, not whatever remote network you're on. So lots of different ways to crack that nut. And it's a great question. And I do think down the road we should probably do a more advanced SSH tutorial and show you all the tips and tricks that you could use to get that rolling. Our first email comes in from Brett. Brett writes in and says, do you have a recommendation for a server operating system for my home lab? I'm currently running a Dell R710 with Ubuntu 18.04. I need ZFS for my storage drives. Then I am running most of my utilities in Docker containers with a few virtual machines for things that I have or haven't or can't move to containers, like my actual router that runs OpenSense in a VM with the PCI network passed through it. I've been contemplating if I should upgrade Ubuntu or just move to another operating system. Thoughts? I should also probably move to a less power hungry and less heat generating machine. But that's another topic. Thanks, Brett. So, Steve, I guess I'll start with your thoughts. What do you think? Is Ubuntu 2104, is that an okay to be, Ubuntu 1804? It's getting a little old in the tooth. Would you just upgrade to the latest version of Ubuntu? Would you start looking for other operating systems? Maybe microphone mute. I'll start. I guess I would tell you first things first. There's nothing wrong with Ubuntu. So if you have Ubuntu and you're comfortable with Ubuntu, and particularly if you've set up ZFS on Ubuntu, never be concerned about going that route. One of the things I love about Linux in general is that many distros will accomplish a lot of the same thing. And so oftentimes what you can do in one operating system, or what you could do in CentOS or Red Hat or whatever else you could do in Ubuntu. So if you like it and it's working for you, I would say just upgrade Ubuntu. There's nothing wrong with that at all. And there's really straightforward support for CFS, which is kind of nice. Now, I personally would look at something like Alma Linux. The downside to Alma Linux is you are going to have to use DKMS to get ZFS to work. And I absolutely would, if you're storing your data on there, absolutely use ZFS. So just be aware that there's some boxes to jump through, but there's tutorials all over the internet. It's a pretty straightforward thing to do, works very well. And I think over time, with the code base rebasing on OpenZFS, I think over time that's eventually going to go away and it's going to be native right into the kernel. Steve, what are your thoughts for Brett? I might have some connection trouble with Steve. I'll have to see if see if he can refresh his session. we'll move on to our second email. Comes in from Terry. Terry writes in and says, "Hi guys, do you have a recommendation for a voice over IP system for business use?" And so, yeah, that's a great question, Terry. So you've got a couple of options. The go-to industry standard for open source VoIP technology is Asterisk. And Asterisk is a very, very powerful server component, has been around for basically as long as the SIP protocol has been in existence. And so one of the things that I really like about it is there's a ton of variations on Asterisk. And the most popular, straightforward way to get rolling with something like Asterisk is to use Asterisk Now. Asterisk Now is a distribution that you can just download the ISO, load it onto a flash drive, install it onto the computer, and basically what you wind up with is a PBX system. So you get the IP address and log into the web UI, and Bob's your uncle, you have a working SIP system. To actually do anything with it, you're going to add the phones to the SIP system, and just doing that is going to allow them to do intercom calling and paging and that sort of thing. Then if you want to take it one step further and you say, hey, I actually want to be able to call out and talk to the world, well, then you're going to have to add a trunk. And so you can go with a trunk provider like Voxtelesys or something like FlowRoute, which is now owned by Inwardo, or however you pronounce it. The other option that you have is to use something like 3CX. And I know, Steve, I don't know if you're back with me yet, but you've used 3CX a fair bit. You've switched over to it. So I guess what I would say is check out 3CX. It is a business VoIP system that is specifically designed to work in a business environment. So where 3CX has some advantages over a traditional Asterisk system is the following. So first of all, there is auto configuration of devices. And so if you purchase a phone, you can literally start shipping phones to your employees. You take the MAC address, you enroll it in the system, and holy cow, there's Steve's back. And the first time you enroll the phone, what's going to happen is that phone comes online. There's a proxy server that actually hands off and says, hey, here's your configuration extension, blah, blah, blah. And it auto configures the phone. And that's been instrumental at Altispeed Technologies because our team is all over the United States. And so when we hire a new support technician, we hire a new engineer, we hire a new developer, we ship them a laptop and a phone. Yep, it arrives. We can drop ship that stuff straight from Amazon or whoever we're buying the phone from. We take the MAC address, we throw it in there, say this is their extension. As soon as that phone comes online, boom, it gets provisioned. The other thing is 3CX has an excellent mobile app. And so you download the mobile app and you're able to sign into your extension as if you were sitting at your phone, which means you have access to transfer calls back and forth, check your voicemail, put callers on hold, all of those sorts of things. Steve, welcome back. Thoughts on Terry and VoIP for Business? Okay, well, we'll have to troubleshoot Steve's connection issue here in just a second. Our third email comes in from Jeremy. Actually, you know what I'm going to do? Here's what we're going to do. We have Matthew Miller with us this week, and so we're going to reorganize the show here just a little bit on the fly, and that's going to give me an opportunity to correct some of these connection issues. This is the problem with doing the show live. But Matthew Miller is my guest this hour. He is the Fedora project lead and a guest this hour on the Ask Noah show, and it's a delight to have him here. We're going to talk Fedora, and after that, Steve and I are going to talk a little bit about our experiences on Fedora and some things that you might want to know before you start using Fedora. Matthew Miller, he is the Fedora project lead and a guest this hour on the Ask Noah show. Matthew, welcome back into the program.
Thank you. It is always nice to be here.
Yeah, it's always nice to have you. So Fedora 35 has been released. Now, it was a little bit delayed, but the end result is better software. And so I don't think that's a problem. I don't think that's a bad thing. Tell me, what did the extra time allow Fedora to accomplish?
Yeah, we just had a few last-minute things where our release criteria weren't being met. Some of the things with KDE, Software Center, some things like that, where we wanted to make sure that everything was a good experience for people. I don't want to just blame KDE. There were other things, but honestly, I am looking forward to Fedora Linux 36 so much right now, I can't even remember what the specifics were. But in general, we've got a set of release criteria that our QA team goes through, quality engineering, quality assurance, goes through and makes sure that everything meets. We run through acceptance tests, and if it doesn't meet our criteria, we don't ship. So we've been trying really hard to make sure that we have something we feel good about shipping, on a really consistent, regular schedule. And for the last few releases, last few years, we've been doing that, which is good for everybody because it helps. It makes it easier to plan. It means the next release, you know where that's going to come out. You're not already it's time to be thinking about the next release now, as I said I am. But if we're still trying to get the previous one out the door, it just makes the next release worse and worse. So keeping the schedule is important, but we also want to make sure that our standards are held to there. So we've always had this hybrid model. It's not a release on this day no matter what, but it's also we do try to keep to the schedule as closely as we can.
Fedora 35 features GNOME 41. Talk a little bit about GNOME 41, specifically the multitasking improvements that are featured in GNOME 41.
Yeah, so this is GNOME 40 is the first really big rethink of the basic desktop environment since GNOME 3 launched quite a while ago, and as I think people probably know, that was kind of a rough adoption, and a lot of people weren't ready for that change. GNOME 3 has actually slowly taken feedback and improved different usability areas since that first pretty stark release, where it was kind of here's our minimalist position. And so GNOME 40 was actually it's time to look at the next steps here, and actually a huge amount of user research went into that to try and make sure that it was what people wanted. People wouldn't be surprised by the big changes, and I think it really paid off. It's a nice improvement. There's a lot of under the hood things, but also a little more usable GUI, I think. And so GNOME 40 just kind of 41 builds on that. There's some nice things for multi-monitor things where you can have different workspaces on both monitors or not as your own choice. And there's a thing I like. There's a power setting thing for laptops, nicely exposed in the menu. Some just little tweaks like that are nice. Some of the settings, again, multitasking, are improved. In the settings control panel, you can decide to turn on and off the hot panel. You can turn on and off active screen edges. These are features that have always been there, but you get more control over them. And you can also choose if you want to have multiple workspaces at a fixed number, or have them spawn and despawn on the fly. So feedback showed a lot of people have different opinions about that. So these kind of things are all options there now.
As a system administrator, Matthew, I often find myself having to remote into Windows PCs. It's not uncommon for me at all to come on site to a client and they'll say, hey, the server isn't working. Well, what's the first thing I'm going to do? Well, the first thing I'm going to do is get onto the network, and I'm going to see if I can RDP into the server. And if I can get access to the server, then maybe we can figure out what their real problem is. And if I can't get access to the server, then I'm going to go search for a physical way to access it. And GNOME 41 has improved the remote desktop capabilities. Talk about the new remote desktop client.
Yeah, there's a thing called connections that is there, and full disclosure, I have not been a working sysadmin for 10 years now, so I am, unlike people who have to do that for their jobs, I'm only hearing about it, so I appreciate your perspective on it, actually. But previously, this was actually a feature in Gnome Boxes, which is a tool for virtual machines. So the idea was that, this was kind of all of your systems connecting things were there, and really, I think a lot of people were finding that didn't make sense. People weren't discovering it there and so on. So they moved that remote desktop functionality to a separate application with kind of a similar look and feel to Boxes, but dedicated towards that remote desktop need. So I think that's a good idea. We're actually looking at that in the Fedora desktop workstation team, looking at something like that for Toolbox as well, which is local container management for your own personal workflows, kind of separating that out and making that a similar tool as well.
Matthew, talk a little bit about the power panel that pops out in the Power Saver. How are these features useful on the desktop?
Yeah, so obviously it's much more useful on a laptop than on a workstation desktop computer. I'm not actually sure if they appear if you don't have batteries, but basically it lets you select the power consumption profile between performance, balance, power saver, and so on. And this is actually something that plumbs all the way from the GNOME desktop to this UI there down to the kernel level. It's actually, as I understand it, the driver here was written by Mark from Lenovo, who actually is the person we work with on the ThinkPad team that we worked with in the Fedora on Lenovo systems thing. And so this feature for actually exposing power information at the low kernel level laptop profiles goes all the way up through the desktop, and kind of that nice plumbed through experience of you can actually set your user profiles right there from the menu, and it's not like a hacked on thing. It actually is going down into kernel level changes to affect how the laptop's performance is scheduled.
Fedora Kenanite is an immutable operating system. So, Matthew, can you talk a little bit about what an immutable operating system is, how it's different from Fedora Silverblue, and what use case Kenanite and Silverblue are targeted for?
Yeah, so basically, I think Colin Walters, who wrote RPM Tree technology this is based on, would probably give me a lecture if I say immutable, because it's actually not quite that it's immutable. We're not shipping an unchangeable write-only image, but it's actually a managed base OS image where it is, instead of it being like, it's not just that it's frozen, but that it is tracked like a get tree, basically, so that you can roll back, go forward, and you can also even layer local changes on top of it. So it's different from an immutable OS, but it is kind of in that same family of approaches where instead of your operating system root, where basically all the software comes with the OS lives, instead of that being something that you basically compose locally, it's something that is composed as a system and then delivered to you as a system. So this is ideas that came from the Atomic project, Red Hat's Atomic project, Fedora Atomic, and CoreOS. And so this is now what's used in Fedora CoreOS today. It's used in our Fedora IoT edition as well. And basically these are cases where you might have a large fleet of machines out there in cloud or in edge situations, and you want them to be manageable as if they are consistent systems. I think as a sysadmin, you can probably relate to the value of this. When you have systems that are basically composed by installing packages or by even compiling things locally, it doesn't take very long for every system to become unique. Even if you're using config management and you're trying to keep them all the same, the ordering and all the stuff, every system becomes its own unique puzzle, which makes debugging hard. So this is technology that first kind of came from the server world, but Silverblue, which uses a GNOME environment, very much like Fedora Workstation, and Kenanite, which is KDE based, are desktop environments using this same technology. And the advantage of this, so one thing is it's going to make it easier to have large scale, if you have a production deployment of a Linux on the desktop at your company, it makes it easier to manage it in the same way that managing a fleet of services that way. And then it's also going to be easier for laptop companies, people shipping Fedora Linux on their systems, to ship something that they feel comfortable that they can provide customer support for, because again, every system you can identify what the state of the software is on it, and it is not having to try and debug an individual unique machine every time when you're trying to do that. It also kind of just by its nature makes a strong separation between that OS level and user level things. So for the desktop environment, we recommend installing applications as Flatpaks on top of that. So they're installed basically, they can be installed system-wide, but they're not, the system-wide applications kind of live in a different place than the actual OS. So they can be updated at a completely different cadence, and they can even, for example, Fedora Linux 35 just came out, and it may be that since Fedora is fast moving, some version of your favorite software actually has a bug or lost a feature, or you're not ready, change the UI and you're not ready to go to that new version of that application yet. You could keep running the previous one, the Flatpak for the previous one, just fine on top of the newer base operating system. Or conversely, if you want to grab a nightly version of something, it's easy to put that there. And the traditional distro model really has everything tightly integrated together, and sometimes it's harder to do that. So having that separation kind of gives more flexibility to applications.
Have you considered expanding the concept of separating user space and I guess the rest of the base OS to create a form of a kiosk? I know one of the use cases that we come across all the time is people that they want a public computer that they want to install an operating system on. They want people to be able to jump onto a browser and browse the internet and check their email and do all the things. And then they don't want those people to be able to destroy, modify, or damage the computer. They essentially want it to come back the same way it was every single time. Has there been any talk or any consideration about, hey, can we expand that to make the user space, again, I'm going to use the word immutable, understand that there's a disclaimer there, but any thought or consideration to making the user space immutable as well, so that the computer is just, as it installs, you use it as it is, every time it reboots, it just comes back to the way it was configured?
Yeah, I actually know there is some work on kiosk mode stuff that is going on. I don't know the details of it, but that is in progress. Probably someone else could fill you in more on that, but I know that that use case is important for this, and there is some work being done on it. Absolutely.
Very cool. Let's talk a little bit about Wire Plumber Session Manager. Obviously, with Fedora 34, we saw some changes to the audio subsystem, and now we have Wire Plumber Session Manager. Talk a little bit about Wire Plumber Session Manager, how that relates to Pipewire, and what all of this does. How does it work?
So, yeah, Pipewire, it's a new audio interface tool for Linux in general, and it basically needs something to detect and configure your devices and keep track of your preferred devices and manage which streams go where and so on. And there was a example session manager that handled those things before, and Wire Plumber is basically a dedicated piece of software that is a little more advanced and more flexible, but also hopefully more robust than the example thing to do that session management. And so, it's basically a drop-in replacement for the built-in thing, but has better integration with the desktop, better scriptable policies, things like that you can use to set up your audio environment just so.
How has Fedora 35 been received by the community? Have you gotten a lot of feedback of people saying, hey, this is really great, I've upgraded, everything has been perfect? Some feedback coming in saying, hey, I upgraded and there's some improvements or some bugs. What's been the general reception?
It's been very positive. I've seen uptake. I still don't have all my numbers in yet. They kind of come in a delay because of the way our stats gathering is. We have non-invasive stats gathering, so I kind of have to wait for observations of what I see from our mirror networks. But the overall release seems to be very well received. One thing I noticed, we have a help forum, Ask Fedora, and our traffic on Ask Fedora was like 5 to 10 times what it normally is after a release. And I don't think that's because there's problems. I think that that forum has gotten more visible, but also I think there's probably a lot of interest in this release that is just shown in that. So that's very cool. One of the particular things, actually, since we just talked about Wire Plumber, there was some ordering case where in some upgrade situations, it didn't get switched over to the new one, and people were left without audio. So I actually saw that problem a lot. There's an easy fix, and actually, we have a common bugs wiki page where we document those kind of things, and the solution was right there. But obviously, that's not visible enough, and it's kind of hard. People don't want to read documentation. It's fair. So we're trying to figure out how to make things like that more visible for when people might run into those in future releases, just to make that more polished. But overall, I think that's very very few negative reports. And actually, I'm always braced for some kind of thing, and I don't think I saw anything super negative this time around. So, and then also a lot of positive. So I think it's going very well so far.
There's obviously a lot of things that change from one release to the next. Can you talk about something that has changed in Fedora 35 that you're particularly proud of? Somebody sits down and says, I've used Fedora, like myself, I've used Fedora from Fedora Core 1 all the way up. What are the most exciting things for me to look forward to in Fedora 35?
So I think this one isn't super dramatic. I think it's more of a polish release, and that's kind of fits into the, we took a little longer to make sure it was out. But I think, like, for example, the GNOME 41 stuff, there's those little changes that are kind of in response to feedback after the GNOME 40 release. So honestly, I don't think you'll see a dramatic splash around this time around, and sometimes that's good. We want to keep it exciting, but we also want to just kind of work on little incremental improvements sometime. And I think this is more of a incremental improvement release. I do think if you are a GNOME user, that power management stuff is there. And another thing, GNOME software is much improved now. It's a much nicer experience, better performance, better UI, better layout overall, and has a nice also the one of the difficulties is presenting all of the software that's available to you and kind of showing you where it comes from and whether it's open source, and if you've enabled third-party repositories, what that means and where it comes from. And it has some nice things around kind of showing you, hey, this is open source, it's built by the community, and I love it. So that's a thing you'll notice if you look through there.
Can you talk a little bit about the first foundation and the updates to key programming languages, system library packages, and why that is important for developers?
Yeah, absolutely. That's, Fedora has our 4 foundations: freedom, friends, features, and first. And first, one of the things is we try to make sure that we're giving, the newest software, not bleeding edge, but as soon as it's ready to go, we try to get it out to you. And so that means, we have new versions of compilers, new language stacks, basically every release. And yeah, as a developer, especially some of those emerging languages, Go, Rust, all those kind of things, like there's new features that people are demanding that are available there. And so that's one of the driving factors for people to use Fedora Linux as an operating system. And one of the things, though, I am pretty happy about the way we do this. We find a balance between getting all those things to you and getting them to you in this usable way. That's why we have releases rather than being a rolling release. So these big boundaries kind of hit, at the Fedora Linux release day. And then, since we support each release with an overlap, so there's 13 months of support for each release, you can actually decide, when during the next 7 months you want to upgrade. You can upgrade right away, or you can wait, skip a whole release if you want, if you weren't quite ready for that change to be there yet. But it's available to you in the newer release as well.
Now that Fedora 35 is out, the march continues towards Fedora 36, as you mentioned towards the top of the interview. Tell me a little bit about the plans. Where are you guys at? How are things going? What are you looking forward to? What are you currently working on?
Yeah, so we are in the planning period where people are basically submitting their changes, saying what are the kind of things we're going to plan to do here. We're going to discuss those kind of things. We're designing what the wallpaper is going to look like. Those kind of things. So we've got, about 20 different changes in at this point that are approved. Some of them are, like you said, the language stacks being updated. Some of them are things a little more controversy, like dropping support for NIS and NIS Plus, which are some fairly old but still well used tools for managing authentication across the network in old Unix shops. So that had some discussion. And we also have some under the hood things where binaries are getting a little bit of metadata attached to them telling what build it was. And that's actually in collaboration with Debian. So that when there's a crash report, you can see exactly what build that is, even across distros. And even if you're using containers or Flatpaks or whatever to mix and match binaries from different sources, you'll be able to kind of see, okay, this crash report matches to this actual build here. So that's not something that is very user-facing, but kind of under the hood things that will eventually make the experience better. And especially that one makes things better for developers in a lot of ways.
with Fedora 37, there is some talk of having ARM7 support removed. So kind of looking into the future, Matthew, why is the decision being considered to remove support for ARM v7? What are some examples of some ARM v7 hardware, and how much of that hardware is there out in the wild? Will users even notice?
Yeah, so the original Raspberry Pi and then up through the Pi Zero. So the Pi Zero 2 is now the newer generation. So that's one of the reasons. And that's a $15 device. That's not too bad that you can get. But yeah, there is quite a bit of that hardware out there, although it is a pretty small fraction of Fedora Linux users in using it. And since it is an older architecture, like it often slows down our builds. So when we do a build in Fedora in our build system, unlike some other distros, actually all of our package builds are done in a central data center, which kind of means we've got control and we know what's going on there where all the package builds come in. But they're actually built for the x86, 32-bit, 64-bit, PowerPC, S390 mainframe architecture, and then 2 ARM architectures. Hopefully adding RISC-V soon. So that's all built simultaneously, and having a slower architecture in there actually slows down everything. So there's a cost to it for us, and it also is kind of a maintenance burden to have a different architecture for the ARM team having to diagnose, this is something that was specific to that architecture and things like that. So reducing those things reduces overhead and lets us focus on what's making the things we do support better. And it seemed like it was probably time in this architecture to move on to the newer thing. I know that there will be people who are disappointed. There are other distros that can cater to those things probably a little better.
Matthew Miller, he is the Fedora project lead and a guest this hour on the Ask Noah Show. Matthew, thank you again for taking the time to join us on the program. Of course, we'll have you back on the program. Open invitation anytime. We'll get you back real soon.
Yeah, cool. I'll be glad to come back. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Matthew. I think we have Steve reconnected. Hey, Steve.
I should be here now.
You are here now. So I saved this email because I really think you do it more justice than I would, but Jeremy wrote in and said, "Hey, Noah and Steve, thanks so much for keeping us informed and educated on all things Linux. I have 2 unrelated questions. The first of which, I can run Fedora 35 on my Panasonic Toughbook CFC2, which I have the drive encrypted and set to auto login due to the fact that I've already entered the drive encryption password. However, it always comes up with a keyring prompt for a password. I would like the system to also automatically unlock the keyring. My second question, regarding the same laptop, on the screen, there are buttons that I assume I can hotkey somehow. I would like to hotkey 1 or 2 of these buttons to rotate the screen. If I have to settle for a keyboard combination hotkey, I guess that would be fine as well. Also, on another note, if there's a way to use the built-in sensors to allow for auto-rotate, that would be awesome. Keep spreading the Linux knowledge and have a great day. Jeremy." So, Steve, thoughts on hotkeying? Essentially, what he's trying to do is get a button on the laptop when he pushes it to execute either a series of things or just a thing. What would you say the best way to go about doing that would be?
So in the past, I've done quite a bit of this back in the XBMC days and the early Kodi days when I'd have, like a random controller that I wanted to do a thing. And so I'm not sure if it still applies under Wayland, but under X, there is a utility called XEV, and it stands for X events. And essentially, you launch this thing in the terminal, and then you push buttons. And as you push buttons, it will give you lots of information like the button ID, the hex code, tons of stuff like that. And with this information, you can use another application called XModMap, and you take the information that you got from XEV and use XModMap to map it somewhere. So, for example, I would push a button on, back in the day, there were like the Windows Media Center remotes, and they had like a Windows logo that actually worked as a button right in the center of the controller.
Okay.
And if you'd push that under XEV, it would give you a bunch of gibberish, and then you could say, okay, if you see this button, react as if you hit the letter R on your keyboard, and then you could do whatever with the letter R inside of Kodi. So you could do something similar here. As for rotating the screen using the built-in sensors, it has been my experience that this is hit and miss. I've had several devices where I've actually just given up on it trying to figure out how to rotate them properly because it's my opinion that it's some magic that's done in the driver. Like I have a 2-in-1 that like flips back and it will rotate the screen the wrong direction from what Linux thinks. And I have to assume that this is just a driver issue. And so instead, I've taken to what he's intending to do and basically put a key combination on my laptop that when I'm folding it over, I just hit that key combination so it rotates the screen into the right direction.
Very cool. Our fourth email comes in and is from Jeremy. Jeremy writes in and says, hey there, quick question. Can one run Google Store apps on Ubuntu phones? He's talking about Ubi ports. I'm thinking I would like to get a used phone and try Ubuntu phone or Ubi ports, but I may want some apps that are only found on the Google Play Store. Best, Jeremy. So the most straightforward answer is Ambox has been around for a long time, so that's an option. However, Waydroid is a much newer and has far more active development behind it than Ambox. Also, doesn't require the Google Services Framework. Now, I will tell you, I am not an expert on the topic, but so far as I understand it, Google is changing the way that they are administrating some of their apps such that you have to have Google services for the apps to work. And so I might see if I can bring in a typical kernel. Are you in the Matrix room?
Yes, I am.
Can you explain? Yeah.
Right. So, slight correction. Neither Ambox nor Waydroid require the Google Services Framework. There are a lot of apps that, irregardless of Google's changes, will refuse to run without the Google Services Framework. However, you can use a third-party unofficial store called the Aurora Store, which is available in F-Droid, and download applications from the Play Store, as long as they still are making the APK available.
Which they
so
have
that
stopped,
is a way.
Which they've stopped doing on some newer apps, right? There's a push or there was a change that they pushed out.
So Google is trying to push everything that direction. It's still up to the developer. Last I checked.
Okay.
So it's going to be hit or miss depending on the app you want to use. I mean, I use F-Droid and the Aurora Store on Lineage OS on an Android device, and that is actually what Waydroid is based on. Their environment is based on stripped down Lineage for their runtime.
Gotcha. I appreciate it. Thanks for chiming in. Yeah, so we'll check that out. We'll have a link for both Waydroid as well as the Aurora Store as well as F-Droid in the show notes. You can get those at podcast.asknoahshow.com. Show's all out of order this week, and that's okay. It's live radio. This is what we do. So, Steve, I want to talk to you a little bit about Fedora. We talked to Matt and got an idea of what's new in Fedora 35. Now, it's been articulated by me numerous times that I have used Fedora since Fedora Core 1. I've upgraded my installation, I've nuked and paved, and what I have found consistently time and time again is the way to get the best experience from a Fedora install is to let it bake for a few weeks, because if you try to run in production on day one, I find all sorts of little paper cuts, and I will give it to the Fedora team. On Fedora 35, I have experienced less of those than I have on previous releases, but they are still there. I wanted to talk to you a little bit about your experience because despite the fact that you're a Red Hat guy, you have on some of your personal machines have run Arch. And when Fedora 35 came out, you said, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to take one of my laptops and I'm going to load it up with Fedora 35. I'm going to run with it and see how it's working. So how's it working?
So I want to preface this by saying I ran Fedora 28 through 32 on a laptop that I use fairly frequently. And I enjoyed the process. I did, like you said, I lagged behind before doing upgrades. This time around, I took my laptop and I wiped it, and I put Fedora 35 on there. Now, I checked my download date. I downloaded the ISO November 5th, so I probably did the install November 6th or 7th. So just give you some idea, it's been about somewhere between 15 and 20 days that I've been using it. And I guess the use case is I do obviously business-related stuff. So I do stuff related to OpenShift. I do SSH. I use my web browser to do things. I have Telegram, kind of normal workload. No gaming on this laptop because it's got the Intel graphics. So that's kind of the use case. And for the most part, I thought, hey, this is going pretty good. And then last week, I decided that I was going to start sequencing lights on my Christmas tree with my Raspberry Pi. And so I started working on that. And I started running into this issue where this laptop that I'm using is always on Wi-Fi, just because that's how I use my laptops. And so I SSH into the Raspberry Pi to run my test code and stuff like that. And the connections would hang as if you put the computer to sleep and then opened it up again. And they just hang. What I found just doing my troubleshooting was if I SSH'd into a host that was wired, like a server or whatever, and then pinged the Raspberry Pi, my sessions would come back on the Fedora box. But it wouldn't matter whether the session had been sitting for a while or I was literally actively typing in the Python REPL. The connection would just freeze from time to time, and that kind of drove me crazy. And then I was doing some hardware hacking, as I do, and there's a GitHub project out there that you basically run some code and then launch your Chrome browser, Chrome or Opera, and that's how you configure this project. So I did a DNF install Google Chrome and didn't think much of it, except the fact that it was actually in the repos. That was nice. But it actually gave me Google Chrome unstable. And I didn't realize this until I went to go file a bug against this project because I wasn't seeing the options that I thought I should see according to the screenshots in the README. As I'm going to file this bug, I realize that I'm running the unstable version. I go back to my command history. I'm like, nope, I definitely just typed Google Chrome. And so I actually had to go back and do a DNF install Google Chrome -stable. And that got me the results that I was expecting. So I had a bunch of these little paper cuts where, for the most part, it was okay. Suspend and resume worked really well, as I would expect it to on Intel hardware. I didn't notice any performance. The battery life was good. And I wonder whether, now that I've been thinking about it, I was listening to Matthew Miller talking about the new power settings, and I wonder whether that's something to do with the power settings. I have no idea, but I eventually put that laptop down because I couldn't deal with the break in my SSH sessions while I'm actively using it. At one point, I wanted to throw my laptop because I thought the Raspberry Pi was broken. Like I kept getting up to check the Pi, like plug a laptop or a monitor into it, and like, no, it's still functioning. So I had to put that laptop down for now.
I would like to say I'm surprised, but that has been my experience with Fedora. It'll be interesting, Steve, to see in a few weeks if you circled back to this, if you pick that laptop back up in let's say the first week of December, and you pick it up, update it, and see if those issues are still there. Because a lot of times what I find is after a few weeks, they just kind of go away. And that there's my box that's sitting downstairs that I love and treasure and have had running Fedora, everything from Fedora Core 1. I've not upgraded it yet to Fedora 35, and I likely won't do so until at least after the Thanksgiving break. I might wait until I have some time on my hands at Christmas and might nuke and pave that baby. But interesting to hear your experiences. Hey, I want to cover some of the picks this week because there's some cool stuff that we've run into. So this actually came to us in the Geek Lab. We'll have a link for you in the show notes at podcast.asknoahshow.com, but it's called the YouTube Spammer Purge. And what it allows you to do is purge all comments left by a particular user on a specific video across your entire channel. And if you're an independent content creator, then one of the things lesson you learn early on is you just don't look at the comments. You don't look at the comments because that's not where productive feedback for your show comes, at least in most cases. And the problem with doing that is you wind up with spam on a lot of your pages. And so this isn't going to prevent spammers from posting on your page. But what it does is it makes it much easier to delete them when they show up. And so hopefully someday YouTube will get around to implementing some of the tooling for this so that this is a native feature of YouTube. But for now, the fact that there is an open source project called YouTube Spammer Purge is super helpful. So I would invite you to check that out. Again, we'll have links for you in the show notes at podcast.asknoahshow.com. In the news this week, Streamlabs has promised to remove OBS from the name of its live streaming software. So Streamlabs OBS, commonly abbreviated SLOBS, following backlash from streamers and the open source community, got upset because OBS says they've asked Streamlabs not to use their name. OBS, the open broadcaster software, the software that we use to stream Ask Noah Show each week, right to your ears, they've been around for a few years, a very popular streaming platform or streaming software, rather, I should say, that has come onto the stage and just taken it by fire. It has now become the default standard for people who want to stream on the internet. And the controversy came up actually previously when a company called Lightstream, another live streaming app, tweeted screenshots of its website right beside Streamlabs saying, "Hey, can I copy your homework?" suggesting that Streamlabs simply just ripped off Lightstream. And so now, as this is coming out, that people are getting upset because they essentially hack on OBS to their platform, and people that are using it are thinking this is coming from the actual OBS people. And so they're getting upset with billing issues and all sorts of things coming back to the OBS team. And the OBS team is saying, "Hey guys, time out. This isn't our product. Yes, we released the code as open source. Yes, the source code is publicly available. If they wanted to fork it or they wanted to use it, I guess we don't have a problem with it. But could you possibly change the name to something to reflect the fact that you're an entirely different entity that has absolutely no connection with us whatsoever? And oh, by the way, if you were so concerned about using our name and weren't going to listen, then why did you ask us in the first place if it was okay to use our name and then we told you no?" So this is fairly embarrassing for Streamlabs, right? Streamlabs later responded to the accusation in a tweet stating that it's going to take immediate steps to remove OBS from its product name. It also notes that Streamlabs OBS is built on top of the OBS open source platform and that its own platform is also open source. It's an interesting excuse. So I hope they get that straightened up, and a huge kudos to the folks over at OBS for what they're doing, because it's a pretty fantastic piece of software. And there are other examples of this in Linux to where you have a piece of software, you say, well, this has kind of become the de facto standard for its kind. OBS is certainly one of those things. I want to draw your attention to a security update that actually came from Synapse. So Synapse, I believe it's 1.47 came out, and there was a pretty huge security flaw. The security vulnerability was that an attacker was able to, under the right circumstances, be tricked into downloading a file from a remote server, and that server could potentially store that file outside of the designated media directory, which is, of course, that's a pretty big deal. And so they have released a new version of Synapse. It's 1.47.1. And if you are using Synapse, if you're an Element or Synapse user, you're absolutely going to want to update to take advantage of that security patch. So again, more information will be available in the actual article over at podcast.asknoahshow.com. But you'll want to do that. And the other thing is, I'll just take a moment to say, they looking through the latest release notes for Element and Synapse, there's a lot of cool features that are finally landing. So threading is finally here. If you're using the beta or nightly version of Element, you now have the option to do message threading. Do not disturb is a function that has come out. And so a lot of the things that those of us that have used other messaging platforms and have said, hey, I'm kind of digging my heels in on Matrix, I'm going to hang out here for a little bit, there are some features that have been missing. Pinning messages, another one. And these things are finally coming to fruition and about to land. And so last I looked, they are looking to land the message threading in iOS and Android next. They have the UI mostly tweaked and polished for the web UI, and so are moving on to mobile development. And so that will be super exciting. So Steve, apologies for the connection problems today. But it's a pleasure having you join me. Well, I'm glad we were able to get it worked out. Do you know anybody that's looking for an open source job?
That's a good question. I know a few people that have kind of settled for something that wasn't open source because they couldn't find what they were looking for easily. Where are you going with this?
Well, so TrueUp.io has a bunch of listings. A bunch of listings to mean over 9,000 job listings right now, open source job listings, everything from information security principal detection engineer to mixed methods researcher. They have senior software engineer positions available. Right now, the world is looking for labor, and open source is no exception. And so we'll have the link to TrueUp.io linked in the show notes, and you can check that out. But if you're one of the people that listen to the show because you say, hey, I'm an open source professional and I work in this environment, or maybe you're looking for a new job, believe me, there are places out there that are hiring, and you'll want to check those out. 9,000 jobs available if you're working. And the nice thing is, many of these jobs are likely to be done remotely. And so might be time to think about a new career. Maybe you've thought about moving into open source. Might be time to do that. Hey, the music in our ears means we're out of time, but don't worry, you can still stay connected to both Steve and I. We're both on Twitter. He's at Linux Evans. I'm at Kernel Linux. The show is at Ask Noah Show. We record this show every Tuesday night at 6 p.m. Central. You can join us live at AskNoahShow.com or join us in our interactive Matrix room. You can join there at geeklab.ninja. The Ask Noah Show will return next Tuesday at 6 p.m. Central. AskNoahShow.com. Have a good week.